For more than a century, Americans have been told a simple story about where Abraham Lincoln came from. A poor boy from a log cabin in Kentucky, raised on hard work and scripture, who rose to save the Union and end slavery. But there is a piece of that story that most textbooks leave out entirely, a secret that Lincoln himself only ever whispered to one person, and swore that man to silence until after his death. When modern geneticists finally tested the DNA of Lincoln's distant relatives in 2015, they weren't just settling an old argument between historians. They uncovered proof of exactly what Lincoln had confessed in private, and alongside it, something else buried in his bloodline that nobody in Lincoln's era could have possibly imagined. To understand why this discovery matters, you first have to understand how brutally different America once was for a child born the wrong way. In the 18th and 19th centuries, being born outside of marriage was not simply a private embarrassment. It was a legal condition. Common law across much of the English-speaking world labeled such a child filius nullius, a Latin phrase meaning nobody's son. That label was not just symbolic. An illegitimate child had no automatic right to inherit property from a father, no legal claim to that father's name, and in many communities, no real path to social respectability, no matter how virtuous or accomplished they later became. The mother bore the heavier burden. Unmarried women who became pregnant could be hauled before local courts, fined, publicly shamed, and in some colonies and early states, whipped or sentenced to a workhouse. The stigma didn't fade after the legal punishment ended. Families quietly folded illegitimate children into their households as nieces, nephews, or wards, rewriting the family story so thoroughly that the truth sometimes vanished for generations. And in the political arena, illegitimacy in your family tree was treated as a weapon. A whisper about a candidate's parentage could be enough to end a career, because it suggested moral corruption ran in the blood, an idea we now recognize as nonsense, but one that carried real weight in that era's politics. This is the world Abraham Lincoln grew up watching from the inside. Sometime around 1850, while riding in a buggy through Menard County, Illinois with his law partner William H. Herndon on the way to a court session, Lincoln reportedly turned to his friend and said something he had apparently never told another living soul. According to Herndon's later writings, Lincoln said, "Billy, I'll tell you something, but keep it a secret while I live. My mother was a bastard, was the daughter of a nobleman, so-called of Virginia." He went on, according to Herndon, to credit his mother entirely for whatever intelligence and ambition he possessed, saying that all he was, or ever hoped to be, he owed to her. Think about the weight of that confession. This was a sitting or future president of the United States, admitting to his closest professional confidant that his own mother had been born illegitimate, and that he believed his own capabilities were inherited from an unnamed Virginia gentleman who had fathered her outside of marriage. Herndon kept that secret locked away for decades, just as he'd promised. Everything changed after Lincoln's assassination in 1865. Herndon spent years afterward crisscrossing the Midwest, interviewing everyone still alive who had known Lincoln as a boy, a young lawyer, and a family man. He collected letters, oral histories, and first-hand recollections with an obsessive thoroughness that historians still rely on today. In 1889, he finally published his findings in a book titled Herndon's Lincoln, The True Story of a Great Life. He knew exactly what kind of reaction it would provoke, and he was right. Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham's surviving son, was furious and spent considerable energy over the following years trying to shape and protect his father's public image, resenting Herndon's willingness to air family secrets. Other defenders of Lincoln's legacy dismissed Herndon outright, questioning his credibility, his sobriety, and his motives. But Herndon had something on his side that his critics couldn't simply argue away, a paper trail sitting quietly in a Kentucky courthouse. Buried in the archives of Mercer County, Kentucky, researchers found a grand jury indictment dated November 24, 1789, charging a woman named Lucy Hanks with fornication. In that time and place, a fornication charge brought against a woman almost always meant one specific thing. She had given birth to a child while unmarried. The existence of that child was, quite literally, the crime being prosecuted. The timeline lined up disturbingly well with what was already known about the Hanks family. Nancy Hanks, who would go on to become Lincoln's mother, was believed to have been born around 1784, with a sister, Sarah, arriving a few years later around 1787, both years before Lucy Hanks is known to have married anyone. Then, just 5 months after that 1789 indictment, Lucy herself wrote out a short note in her own hand, giving her consent to marry a man named Henry Sparrow. Her spelling was rough, her handwriting plain, but the document survives to this day, a small, human artifact of a young woman trying to settle her life. Lucy and Henry married on April 30th, 1790, and within a month, the fornication charges against her were formally dropped. Marriage, in the eyes of that era's law and community, effectively erased the crime. But it didn't erase it for Nancy. She kept the surname Hanks, her mother's maiden name, because under English common law, a child born outside marriage legally followed the mother's line, not the father's. Whoever Nancy's biological father was, he was never named in any surviving record. He simply disappears from history. For more than 100 years after Herndon's book came out, historians argued bitterly over what this evidence actually proved. Some researchers, like early Lincoln biographer William Barton, largely accepted Herndon's account and treated Nancy Hanks's illegitimacy as historical fact. Others pushed back hard. A Kentucky-based researcher named Lewis Warren spent years building an alternative theory, arguing that Lucy Hanks had actually been a widow previously married to a man named James Hanks, and that she was in fact born Lucy Shipley, sister to two other Shipley women in the same county. If true, this would have made Nancy's birth legitimate and would have completely undercut Herndon's version of events. Warren was not shy about his confidence. In writings from the 1940s, he described the illegitimacy theory as little more than one of the persistent Herndon myths that needed correcting. For decades, this argument consumed serious scholarly energy. Researchers built competing family trees, hunted for scraps of land records and church registers, and picked apart each other's conclusions in historical journals. But frontier Kentucky in the late 1700s simply hadn't kept the kind of records that could settle a dispute like this definitively. The paper trail ran out, and the debate calcified into two entrenched camps that neither side could fully dislodge. It took a tool that didn't exist in Herndon's lifetime or in Lewis Warren's to finally break the deadlock: mitochondrial DNA analysis. In 2015, a group of genetic genealogists, including researchers such as Suzanne Holstrom, Nancy Royce, and Gerald Haslam among others, launched what became known as the Nancy Hanks Lincoln mtDNA study. Some of these researchers had already spent decades quietly digging through archives like the Library of Congress and various historical societies, trying to nail down Nancy Hanks's maternal ancestry the old-fashioned way. Now, they had access to a kind of evidence no 19th or 20th century researcher ever could have used. Mitochondrial DNA is genetic material passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, along an unbroken female line. Unlike the DNA in a cell's nucleus, it doesn't shuffle and recombine with each generation. A woman alive today can carry mitochondrial DNA nearly identical to that of a female ancestor who lived hundreds of years earlier, as long as the maternal line between them was never broken. This mattered enormously for the Lincoln case because Abraham Lincoln himself has no living direct descendants. His last known descendant, a great-grandson named Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith, died in 1985 without children, and the direct Lincoln line ended with him. But mitochondrial DNA doesn't require testing Lincoln's own descendants. It only requires testing anyone who shares an unbroken maternal line back to the same female ancestor, which meant researchers could look at descendants of Lucy Hanks's other daughters, her sisters, and other maternal relatives entirely. The research team spent years tracking down living women who could document an unbroken maternal line back to Anne Lee Hanks, who was Lucy Hanks's mother and Nancy's grandmother. They split their subjects into two comparison groups. The first group consisted of documented maternal line, descendants of Anne Lee Hanks and her husband Joseph Hanks, people whose family trees, if Herndon's account was correct, should all carry an identical, traceable mitochondrial signature. The second group consisted of descendants of the Shipley sisters, Rachel and Naomi Shipley, the family that Lewis Warren had insisted was Lucy Hanks's true origin. If Warren's theory held up, this second group should have shown a genetic connection to the first. The actual DNA testing was carried out by a laboratory called Gene by Gene in Houston, Texas, and the results were made public on October 21, 2015, deliberately timed to the 150th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. The findings were unambiguous. Every single tested descendant in the first group, the documented Hanks line, carried an identical and highly specific mitochondrial signature. Every single tested descendant of the Shipley sisters carried a completely different, much more common signature, one belonging to haplogroup H, one of the most widespread mitochondrial lineages in all of Europe. There was no overlap between the two groups at any point in recorded or even prehistoric memory. Lewis Warren's Shipley theory, which had survived as a serious academic position for the better part of a century, was conclusively disproven. Herndon had been right all along. Lucy Hanks was exactly who he said she was, and Nancy Hanks Lincoln was, in the plainest genetic and historical sense, the child of an unmarried mother and an unidentified father. But the study didn't stop at settling the legitimacy question. When researchers looked closely at exactly which mitochondrial haplogroup the Hanks line belonged to, they found something nobody involved had anticipated. The signature carried by every documented Hanks descendant belonged to haplogroup X1c, an extraordinarily rare lineage, especially among families with deep colonial American roots. To understand why this detail matters, it helps to know a little about how mitochondrial haplogroups work. Every human being alive today can trace their maternal line back, eventually, to a common female ancestor who lived in Africa roughly 150,000 years ago. As her descendants spread outward across the globe over tens of thousands of years, small genetic mutations accumulated along different maternal lines, creating distinct, trackable signatures that geneticists use almost like historical timestamps, marking when and where different population groups split apart and migrated. Most Americans with colonial-era European ancestry carry one of a fairly small handful of common haplogroups, things like H, J, T, U, or K, reflecting the well-documented waves of migration from the British Isles, Ireland, and Germany. Haplogroup H alone accounts for something close to half of all mitochondrial lineages found in people of European descent. If you tested almost any random person whose family tree traces back to colonial Virginia, odds are overwhelming you'd find one of these familiar markers. Haplogroup X1c is a different story entirely. Haplogroup X as a whole split into two major branches roughly 20,000 years ago, around the time of the last ice age. One branch, X2, did spread into parts of Europe, the Caucasus region, and even shows up in small numbers among some Native American populations, though it remains uncommon, found in only around 2% of Europeans overall. The other branch, X1, took an almost entirely different geographic path. It's concentrated primarily in North Africa, the Horn of Africa, and parts of the Near East, showing up in populations across Egypt, Ethiopia, and the wider Levant region, but it never became established in significant numbers across Northern and Western Europe. Remarkably, the single highest concentration of haplogroup X anywhere on Earth today is found among the Druze communities of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, where estimates suggest it appears in roughly a quarter of the population, making the Druze something like a living genetic snapshot of an ancient Near Eastern population that once had a wider geographic footprint. X1c specifically is considered one of the rarer subbranches within that already uncommon X1 group. Ironically, researchers noted that this extreme rarity actually strengthened their conclusions about the Hanks family line, because finding an identical, unusual signature across multiple independently tested descendants is far more convincing evidence of shared ancestry than finding a common one would have been. It's important to be careful about what this genetic detail does and doesn't mean. It says nothing at all about the identity of Nancy Hanks's biological father, the mystery man Lincoln vaguely described as a Virginia nobleman. It doesn't reveal some hidden recent scandal or secret parentage from Lincoln's own generation. What it points to instead is something much older and, in its own way, more quietly remarkable. At some point deep in the past, hundreds or even thousands of years before Lucy Hanks was ever born, a maternal ancestor of this Virginia colonial family carried genetic roots connecting back to populations in North Africa or the Near East. It's a small but genuine crack in the popular myth that colonial American families of European descent were some kind of unbroken, ethnically uniform bloodline. Human migration, mixing, and movement across regions and centuries has always been far messier and more interconnected than the simplified stories passed down through family lore, or through nationalist mythology, ever allowed for. The X1c finding doesn't rewrite anything scandalous about Lincoln personally. It simply reminds us that purity of ancestry, in the way it was once imagined and weaponized, was never really real to begin with. With all of this genetic and historical detail laid out, it's worth stepping back and remembering that Nancy Hanks was a real person, not just a footnote in someone else's biography. She was born around 1784, most likely in what was then Hampshire County, Virginia, an area that today sits within Mineral County, West Virginia. In 2008, the Mineral County Historical Society formally recognized a research site there as her likely birthplace, and the following year, West Virginia's House of Delegates passed a resolution honoring her memory during the bicentennial of her son's birth. She grew up on the rough edge of the American frontier, in a world where record-keeping was sparse and inconsistent at best. This wasn't a well-documented urban parish with careful church registers. It was backcountry America, where families moved constantly, congregations were scattered and irregular, and official paperwork was often an afterthought. No birth certificate for Nancy survives. No marriage record for Lucy exists from before Nancy's birth. Almost everything historians know comes from fragments, scattered census entries, old court filings, and recollections gathered from aging relatives decades after the fact. Nancy was raised from infancy by her grandparents, Joseph and Lee Hanks. When Joseph died around 1793, 9-year-old Nancy went to live with her aunt, Elizabeth Hanks, and Elizabeth's husband, Thomas Sparrow, and for a time she was actually known by the surname Sparrow, adding yet another layer of confusion to later efforts to trace her origins. Illegitimacy, it turns out, wasn't a one-time anomaly in this family. Elizabeth and Thomas Sparrow also took in and raised another child born outside marriage, a boy named Dennis Hanks, born in 1799 to one of Nancy's younger aunts. It was a pattern that ran quietly through multiple branches of the family, largely unspoken. Despite the circumstances of her birth and the instability of her early life, those who knew Nancy as an adult describe her as intelligent, deeply religious, and remarkably capable for her time and place. She learned to read, she learned needlework, and she worked for families in her community before marrying Thomas Lincoln in 1806.